I want to talk to you about vibration in woodworking because, in my view, over the years I've learned how negative vibration is, and it's always counterproductive to the task. So if I'm sewing or planing, sometimes using a chisel or a spokeshave, things like that, it seems to counter my effort. My energy is opposed by this tool, by the wood, by many different things. So I want to talk to you about that because there are resolutions to it. You can solve these problems, and that's what I want to do. To minimize vibration is my task most of the day in some way that I'm working with wood. I take it for granted, and I don't want you to take it for granted. I want to show you how I've countered this negativity in my woodworking, and I think you'll enjoy what you see and you'll understand why we want to stop it. One of the problem tools that I've come across working with students through the years is the spokeshave, and the reason I want to cover this is because it seems to cause problems for people and they abandon it rather than mastering it, and often it's down to vibration. So let me give you an example. I've got this spokeshave, it's my spokeshave, and when I push this across the end grain here, I immediately get this vibration in the whole surface. Now that could be as a result of the tool not being sharp. It could be having too much blade protruding past the sole of the spokeshave. It could be the position of my wood. You could see then, because it slipped, it wasn't secure in the vise all the way. So what we're going to do first of all, we're going to try lowering this in the vise. I'm putting it on this side, so it's going into a kind of a V in the vise there. Now then, I feel like I'm getting less vibration, but I'm still getting vibration. So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to back my iron off a little bit until I'm just kissing the surface of the wood. Now I can feel it's very different, and I've actually got rid of 90% of my chatter that I just caused in there, or that scudding. So that's one way of reducing that vibration. The other one is going to be a little bit of beeswax, furniture polish, or even the oil in a can oiler like this. That will work fine too. And what this does is it reduces the friction between the wood and the sole of the plane, and it is amazing what this does. Whether it's now see, I'm getting vibration again, but I'm going to skew my plane, my spokeshave, so I'm feeling for the grain. I might even reverse it and pull it like this. So I'm getting a smooth cut now, and that's simply being conscious that I put it lower in the vise. If I go high in the vise, like this, it's completely unsupported. Right on that very end there, I've got this undulation in the surface, and every time I go back with subsequent strokes, it's going to worsen and worsen and worsen. I've got to change direction. I can see that my angle was presented this way. If I go back in the vise and go in the opposite direction here, I'm changing the whole dynamic of the spokeshave. So, and if I go really low in the vise, I can eliminate it altogether. So it's about adjustment, it's about being conscious of where the vibration is coming from and trying three or four different things. It could even be the wood you're using. Some woods have very high resin in them. The pine has a very high resin content, which will cause that friction. So these are different ways that we tackle these problems. What I want to do is just take a couple of swipes with this plane here, like this. Now if I take a swiping stroke, the wood doesn't have chance to answer back. I'm using a lot of power, a lot of force, and that generally overcomes the power, the resistance that I'm getting. But if I go slowly, like this, I can feel and I can see in the surface, I can see this chatter in the surface. What I have to consider, is it friction on the wood? Is it the position of the wood in relation to the bench and the tightness in the vise? Is it the amount of cutting iron that I've got protruding past the sole face? Or is it some other adjustment that I've got to think about? So first of all, I'm going to go as low as I can in the vise to see what difference I get here. It's very different. I still feel a little bit of flex in the wood, but I can't go any lower. So now I've got to consider backing off my plane iron. So I'm taking the plane iron back up into the throat. I'm getting a completely different sound. And I've got no vibration. There's no vibration there. But one added thing I will always do is I'm going to reduce the friction between the sole and the surface of the wood. This is just my my rag in a can oiler. I use that all the time. You could use beeswax and put that on. This makes absolutely, you can even hear the difference. I can hear it, I can feel it, and it just glides across the surface of the wood. So I've eliminated that vibration because of the position of the wood, because of the adjustment of the plane. Now I want to look at some end grain, and I'm going to take my plane on here and take a couple of shavings. I'm not worried about the outcut in this case. Now this is working well on the end grain. Let me take another plane. This is a smaller plane. Let me see if I can. So I'm struggling a bit here, and that mostly it's because I've got friction. So it is jumping, it is scudding across the surface. I'm backing off my iron too much. And I keep working the plane on the surface of the wood. And sometimes when you're planing this end grain, you'll hear this very high-pitched vibration, a harmonic setup, and then I go to the oil, I wipe it across the sole here like this, and I immediately eliminate the vibration. So these are ways that we have to work with our tools, work with the planes, adjustment, adjusting our position, adjusting our attitude. Sometimes I might take this same piece of wood and go this way in the vise so that I'm pushing into the body of the wood of the bench itself. And I get this really solid feel about it. Not always can you do that. The wood may be too wide. There are things like that. Sometimes I go on this side of the vise, low down, and I'm doing fine, no problem. But when I go to this side of the vise, something changes. Now I can feel opposition again. And that's because you've got to remember that wood is like straws being stood up on end like this. So when I'm pulling this apart. I'm not opposing it, compressing it between a pressure point. And these are the things that I have to consider because I've got vibration on this outcut that I didn't get here at the very beginning. If I go on the inside again, very low down in the vise, absolutely zero vibration. And that's what I'm looking for all the time. So I make these micro adjustments with my plane just to see how I can better every situation. So it is corresponding with exactly what I'm feeling, what I'm hearing. And I work on my planes that way. I work with my wood. I listen, I feel, I smell. All of those different things are all part of the sensitivity we've got to make those micro adjustments and make the plane, make the tools work better. I'm going to take a regular 10-inch flat file. If I file the end of wood, which we often do, it's the same with wood or metal. When we start filing the end grain, there we have these high-pitched vibrations that are taking place. If we go low in the vise, it's exactly the opposite. See, now we're getting smooth cuts. So what was happening when I'm high up in the vise, what's really happening on this end grain, and it would be the same in wood, this is vibrating here, and it's setting up a series of vibrations in the surface of the wood, and it reflects exactly that vibration. So when I go low in the vise, I'm getting a high-pitched vibration there. All right, so I change direction. And all of a sudden, I've changed the whole dynamic. This is what we do constantly with either with just a flat file, a three-cornered file, we're filing the teeth on our saw, is minimizing that distance between being really constrained by the vise and then rather than having it extended way above the vise. So keep adjusting, micro-adjusting. It wasn't just a question of going in one direction, it was a question of changing direction altogether. Sometimes we have to do that. In practice, when we're chopping mortises and things like that, we usually try to anchor our wood either to the bench top or in the vise. And if I'm working on edge grain with a chisel and I've got a mortise to cut in a narrow surface like this, I would go straight in the vise. It's nice and solid. I've got the opposition of the vise itself, the weight of the vise, the sheer bulk of the vise, and that's great. If I go in the vise this way and I start chopping, I don't have that solid feel. I can feel the vibration. It's going through my arms and I can hear it vibrating. Those little tiny synapses are working in my brain. So what do? I come on the bench top often. I'll anchor this to the bench top and I'll chop directly over the leg. And this is the difference. Now I've got a really positive, I can go a much deeper cut than I could in the vise because I've not got this counterproduction that's taking place. There are other elements that I have to consider, is the size of my wood, the thickness of my wood, the wide of the board. Usually if it's a wide board, I have to go on the bench top because I cannot put it in the vise to work that way. But then there's the consideration of where on the bench top. So when I was chopping then, I went directly over the top of the leg. So listen to this. Nice and solid. If I move away, less solid, but still solid because the vise is underneath and I've got the counterweight of the vise opposing the hammer blow. Move over here and it's a whole different ball of wax. Move way over here and it's completely different. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, if I put a glass of water here over the leg and I hammer as near to it as I can, the surface of the water isn't moving very much at all. If I go over here, and even if I hammer here, and I move towards it, by the time I've got here, I've got all the ripples in the surface of the water. It's very exaggerated. It's just an example. So would I chop a mortise there? I might have to. If I've got a big board of wood, I might have to chop here, but it will be less productive. So I move the board nearer to this source where I've got this direct connection between the bench top, the leg, down to the concrete floor or the solid floor. So that's one of the things that I'm looking for if I'm chopping with a chisel. So try and reduce that vibration and you'll find the cut is much more productive. Sometimes it seems obvious to me when I'm using a tool like a hammer, driving a nail, things like that. I kind of understand how the wood, the material, how the tool is going to work for me, but sometimes you may not know that. So if you take a hammer and a nail and drive it in the vise like this, listen to this. Again, we're talking about vibration, we're talking about resistance. Listen. I see everything on my bench is vibrating somewhere. If I take the same nail and drive it over the leg of my bench here, listen to the difference. Very nice. It's not causing me an issue. But then again, there are things that you do with the nail when you're driving the nail. If you encompass the nail, I've got my 3 fingers, my thumb is opposite. I'm really tight on that nail until I've got it in there, and then I can really drive it. Once it's in, I can drive it and it feels really solid. It's the bench top that's doing it. Pick your spot, pick the place where you can, if you can, and you'll find it'll be a lot easier to drive that nail. Sawing is where I encounter the most vibration, I think, of any of the tools that we use, we woodworkers. Sawing is probably the one that causes the greatest problem. I'm going to take my dovetail saw, which is just a small tenon saw, and watch this here. I'm getting a vibration because I'm so high up in the vise, and you know that if you know anything about woodworking. I'm cutting my dovetails, I go low in the vise, like this, but do I always go low in the vise? Not necessarily. Watch this. So I'm getting a totally different feel from the material now, a different feel from the tool. Let me go back up in the vise and show you one trick. Sometimes you can't go lower in the vise because it has to stick, because the wood is too long. So we go in here. When we start the saw, listen to this. So I've got vibration, the wood is flexing away from me. What I do to counter that is I put pressure back here, I'm pulling on this material, and I push with my right hand, and I reduce that vibration. One of the other things that I love to do is tell people about my ragging a can oiler, because it's worked for me for 50 years. Just rub that on the side of your saw plate, any saw. It will not affect the material. All it was going to do is going to make this saw flow through the wood. So if I go in here, I counter the opposing pressure with the hand saw, the dovetail saw, and it's cutting like a dream. But when I do this and I pull against the wood here, and I saw, and I've got the oil on the plate as well, this is when it becomes pure joy. So it's more a question of feeling that and making sure you take care of that with every one of your saws. Now then, of course, we have this variety of saws. We've got long saws, we've got short saws. So this is what I would normally do for my tenon saws. Would I do it any differently for other saws? Well, hand saws are used for different tasks, so we're going to look at those next. So when you've got a hand saw like this one, this is a panel saw, it's a short hand saw, and it's a wonderful saw. If you're sawing with this, again, dropping the wood into the vise, watch what happens here. I've got a vibration here. I can pull against it, just like I've done with the tenon saw, but I can also drop my hand here, lower my body, and I get a completely different feeling. I still can lower this into the vise and get a completely different feeling just by moving it down there. So how does it work when you're cross-cutting a piece of wood? Well, would you cross-cut it this way? This is one way, but watch what happens. You've got to remember now that these are the straw. This is where wood has these long stringy fibers that are going in this direction. So when I push with the saw, I get a completely different feeling. This is the wood is really bending away from me. So again, I get a completely different sound by countering, by absorbing that pressure into my body, making sure that the material is fully supported and I get the premium cut that I want. What about if you've got a long piece? Let's take this piece of wood and put this in the vise slightly differently. Let's put this in the vise this way. Now remember what's happening down at the bottom here is these fibers are being compressed because they're the long strings and strands of wood. The cells are all shooting up to the sky. When I go in the vise here and I start sawing down here, this is when I've got the most opposition from this vibration. Completely opposite. So watch what happens. I counter it with my fingers on this side, just like that. So my fingers are now pulling the wood towards me. And then I drop my hand here. I get a much better cut. But what happens if I put this in the vise this way? Bearing in mind I've got 3 metal bars in here, so I've got to be conscious of that as I'm sawing. Watch what happens now. There's another vibration, and I can counter that now. So by lowering the piece of wood into the, this is putting this into a rip mode. This is changing the dynamic. This is the equivalent of me kneeling across a board that I'm sawing overhand like this. It's the same dynamic so I can cut that way. What happens sometimes is we get long pieces of wood, we can't put them in the vise, we have to cross cut them, rip cut them on the bench top. And so this is what I would do. Generally, if I've got to cut this now, let's say I want to cross cut this, I've got movement taking place at the far end there, and I can feel the vibration. If I took a clamp or maybe two clamps like this and just tighten this down to the bench top, this gives me the kind of security I'm really looking for in my operation while I'm working. So I put one clamp here, I could put another clamp down here. All of a sudden, this is taking on a whole different dynamic. This is working perfectly. I feel very secure. I've got zero vibration, and the wood is cutting exactly how I want it to. I can take this now, move it up along here, and I can saw along the grain this way, so overhand again, sawing down the piece of wood. I feel quite confident, but I can feel the wood flexing, flexing, flexing. So I'm going to bring this a little nearer to the bench top. Again, it's about opposition, it's about resistance. We get resistance that helps us, which is the bench. We get resistance that's coming against us, which is vibration. So now I feel very confident in my strokes. I've reduced the vibration. To reduce the friction is critical. Again, I reduce the friction by taking the oil in the rag and just wiping that across the surface, and I have a wonderful sawing experience. And that's what this anti-vibration is all about. This is why I'm sharing these things with you, because the culmination of our work is to enjoy the work. It's a wonderful feeling when the saws, the chisels, the planes are all working optimally. But when we become conscious, we adjust our attitude, we adjust ourselves to take care of these small details. And by the end of it, you can keep looking now for the rest of your life, looking for vibration to counter it in your working life as you're working with your material.